Emily had always known that working as an Uber Eats delivery driver in New York City came with its risks, especially on the weekends. At 18, she was no stranger to the anxiety that gripped her during her late-night shifts. Navigating the bustling streets with caution, she always kept an eye on her surroundings. Despite the occasional unsettling encounter, she found solace in the city's vibrancy and the promise of a paycheck. Little did she know, her mundane job would soon spiral into a nightmare beyond her wildest fears. It was a chilly Friday night when Emily received an order to deliver a pizza to a mansion on the outskirts of the city. The location was unusual, far removed from the typical high-rises and apartment buildings she frequented. As she drove towards the address, the urban landscape gave way to desolate roads and towering trees. The mansion loomed ahead, its Gothic architecture standing in stark contrast to the night sky. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine but dismissed it as the cold. The mansion was shrouded in darkness, with only a few dim lights flickering inside. Emily parked her car and approached the grand entrance, the sound of her footsteps echoing eerily. She hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming for her to turn back, but she brushed the feeling aside and rang the doorbell. The door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged man with an unsettling smile. He introduced himself as Victor and invited her inside to complete the delivery. Reluctantly, Emily stepped into the dimly lit foyer, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the distant murmur of voices. Victor led her down a long corridor, the walls adorned with strange symbols and ancient tapestries. Emily's unease grew with every step, her heart pounding in her chest. They entered a large room where a group of people dressed in dark robes gathered around a large table. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, and Emily's skin prickled with fear. "We've been expecting you," Victor said, his smile widening as he handed her a wad of cash. "Please, stay and join us for a moment." Emily's instincts screamed at her to leave, but curiosity held her in place. The cult members began chanting in a language she couldn't understand, their voices rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence. Suddenly, the room's temperature dropped, and a palpable sense of dread filled the air. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Emily turned to flee, but the cult members closed in on her. Panic surged through her veins as she struggled against their grip. They overpowered her, dragging her to the center of the room where a large pentagram was drawn on the floor. Emily fought desperately, her screams echoing off the walls. "You are the chosen vessel," Victor intoned, his eyes gleaming with malevolent delight. "Tonight, we summon a demon to inhabit your soul." Emily's heart raced as she thrashed against her captors. They began the ritual, chanting louder as they bound her to the pentagram. She felt a sharp pain in her side as a knife sliced through her skin, the warm blood trickling down her body. Desperation fueled her strength, and with a burst of adrenaline, she managed to break free from their grasp. In a frantic scramble, Emily bolted towards the door, her vision blurred by tears of pain and terror. She stumbled through the dark corridors, the cult members' shouts echoing behind her. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to keep moving, to escape the nightmare that threatened to consume her. Bursting through the mansion's entrance, Emily raced to her car and fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She glanced back at the mansion, its sinister silhouette looming ominously. As the engine roared to life, she sped away, her heart still pounding in her chest. Relief washed over her as the mansion disappeared from view. She had escaped, but the ordeal had left her shaken and scarred. Emily thought the nightmare was over, but a lingering sense of dread told her otherwise. In the days that followed, Emily tried to resume her normal life, but something had changed. A dark presence seemed to shadow her every move, an invisible weight pressing down on her soul. She began to notice strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, whispers in the dead of night, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. One evening, as she stared at her reflection in the mirror, Emily saw a flicker of something dark and malevolent in her eyes. Panic surged through her as she realized the horrifying truth. The cult had succeeded in attaching the demon to her soul. It was only a matter of time before it would fully possess her, and those around her would suffer. Determined to rid herself of the demonic curse, Emily sought help from priests, occult experts, and anyone who might have knowledge of such matters. But the more she learned, the more hopeless her situation seemed. The demon's influence grew stronger each day, eroding her will and spreading fear among her loved ones. Emily knew she had to find a way to banish the demon before it was too late. She couldn't bear the thought of becoming a vessel for evil, of bringing harm to those she cared about. The haunting knowledge of her impending possession weighed heavily on her, but she refused to give up. As the days turned into weeks, Emily's strength waned. She could feel the demon's presence growing stronger, taking control of her thoughts and actions. She fought with every ounce of her being, but the battle was relentless. One fateful night, Emily lost her final grip on reality. The demon seized control, twisting her thoughts and warping her actions. She looked in the mirror one last time, seeing not her own reflection, but the malevolent grin of the demon now free within her. In a final, tragic moment of clarity, Emily realized she was no longer in control. The demon had won, and the world would soon know its wrath. A few days later, Emily's friend, Sarah, came to check on her after not hearing from her. She knocked on the door, calling out for Emily. When the door creaked open, Sarah's blood ran cold at the sight that greeted her. The person standing there looked like Emily, but there was a darkness in her eyes, a twisted smile playing on her lips. It was too late when Sarah realized, with a chilling certainty, that there was no Emily anymore. The house on Shadow Lane. Lena had been working as a food delivery worker for several years, and she thought she had seen it all. But nothing could have prepared her for the night she received an order from the Thompsons, a young couple who had recently inherited an old mansion on the outskirts of town. The house was located on a deserted, winding road that locals referred to as Shadow Lane, and it was known for its dark history and eerie atmosphere. The night was unusually cold and misty as Lena drove up to the mansion. The large, imposing structure loomed out of the darkness, its windows like black, soulless eyes. She shivered as she parked her car and grabbed the delivery bag, hoping to make this her last delivery of the night. As she approached the grand front door, it creaked open before she could knock, revealing the smiling faces of the Thompsons. "Hi there. You must be Lena. Come in, Mrs. Thompson said warmly. She was a petite woman with dark hair and bright eyes that seemed to twinkle with excitement. Her husband, Mr. Thompson, was tall and broad-shouldered, with a genial demeanor that put Lena at ease despite the ominous setting. "It's the end of my shift," Lena said, glancing at her watch. "I'm glad you're my last stop." "Oh, wonderful," Mr. Thompson exclaimed. "Why don't you stay and join us for dinner? We ordered a little extra, and it would be nice to have some company." Lena hesitated, but the couple's enthusiasm was infectious. "Sure, why not?" she replied. "It's been a long night, and I could use a meal." They led her into a spacious dining room that was filled with antique furniture and lit by a large chandelier. The table was set with fine china, and the aroma of the food was inviting. As they settled down to eat, the Thompsons began to recount the strange occurrences they had experienced since moving into the mansion. "It started with odd noises," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "At first, we thought it was just the house settling, but then we started seeing shadowy figures in the hallways." Mr. Thompson nodded. "And objects move on their own. Just yesterday, I saw a chair slide across the floor by itself." Lena listened intently, her curiosity piqued. "That sounds terrifying. Have you thought about getting the place checked out by a paranormal investigator?" Mrs. Thompson laughed nervously. "We've considered it, but we're also trying to understand the history of this place. It's been in my family for generations, and there are so many stories." As they talked, Lena took a bite of the food and immediately noticed something strange. The taste was off, metallic and bitter. She glanced at the Thompsons, who were watching her intently, their expressions unreadable. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she realized too late that the food had been drugged. Her vision blurred, and she struggled to stand, but her legs gave out beneath her. What's happening?" she managed to whisper. Mr. Thompson leaned in, his face a mask of cold determination. "I'm sorry, Lena, but we didn't invite you here just for dinner. You see, this house, it requires a sacrifice." Mrs. Thompson's eyes gleamed with a sinister light. "We are descendants of a long line of occult practitioners. To secure our place in this mansion and appease the spirits that haunt it, we need to sacrifice a soul." Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to fight back, but her strength was rapidly fading. The room spun around her, and darkness encroached on the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw was the Thompsons standing over her, chanting in a language she couldn't understand. When Lena awoke, she found herself in a dark, cavernous room beneath the mansion. The walls were covered in ancient symbols, and the air was thick with the scent of incense and decay. She was bound to a stone altar, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. The Thompsons stood at the foot of the altar, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of candles. They were dressed in ceremonial robes, and their eyes were filled with an otherworldly fervor. "It's time," Mr. Thompson said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "The spirits demand a sacrifice, and you, Lena, have been chosen." Mrs. Thompson raised a ceremonial dagger, its blade glinting in the candlelight. "With your life force, we will bind the spirits and secure our inheritance." Lena tried to scream, but no sound came out. She could only watch in horror as the ritual unfolded, the chanting growing louder and more frenzied. The dagger descended, and pain seared through her body. Her vision went dark, and she felt her soul being ripped from her mortal form. The Thompsons continued their chant, their voices blending into a single, unearthly note. As Lena's life force drained away, she felt herself being pulled into a cold, shadowy realm. She was surrounded by the tormented spirits of those who had been sacrificed before her, their faces twisted in eternal agony. Her consciousness faded, and she became one with the mansion's haunted past, another soul trapped within its cursed walls. Back in the dining room, the Thompsons completed the ritual, their faces alight with triumph. They could feel the power of the spirits coursing through the house, binding them to it and ensuring their place as its rightful owners. For a while, they lived in peace, enjoying their new home and the wealth it brought. But as time passed, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the sounds of the house. But they grew louder, more insistent, until they filled every corner of the mansion. The shadows, too, became more pronounced. Dark figures loomed in the hallways, their eyes burning with a malevolent light. Objects moved on their own, often with a force that was impossible to ignore. The Thompsons tried to ignore the growing sense of dread that permeated their home, but it was impossible to escape. The spirits were restless, their hunger insatiable, and Lena's spirit, in particular, seemed to haunt them with a vengeance. One night, as they lay in bed, they heard a voice whispering in the darkness. It was Lena, her tone filled with a cold, vengeful rage. "You will never be free," she hissed. "This house will consume you, just as it consumed me." The Thompsons bolted upright, their hearts pounding. They could feel her presence, cold and oppressive, surrounding them. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. Desperate, they tried to leave the mansion, but the doors wouldn't budge. The windows were sealed shut, and the house itself seemed to conspire against them. They were trapped, just as Lena had been, and the realization sent a chill down their spines. As the days turned into weeks, their sanity began to fray. They could hear the spirits whispering, mocking them, and they could see the shadows moving with a life of their own. The mansion had become a prison, and there was no escape. In the end, the Thompsons succumbed to the darkness. Their once bright and happy faces became hollow and gaunt, their eyes filled with the same torment that had consumed Lena. The mansion had claimed them just as it had claimed so many before. And so, the house on Shadow Lane remained, a monument to the dark forces that resided within. It stood as a testament to the power of the occult, and to the souls that were forever trapped within its walls. Lena's spirit, along with the others, lingered in the shadows, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to cross the threshold. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent with each passing day. The shadows danced, and the mansion stood as a grim reminder of the price of power and the true cost of greed. And somewhere in the darkness, Lena's spirit watched, her eyes filled with a cold, unyielding fury, waiting for the day when the cycle would begin anew. The eternal feast. Eddie had been struggling to make ends meet for months. Working as a food delivery driver wasn't exactly his dream job, but it was the only thing keeping a roof over his head and the bills paid. So when he received a high-paying gig to deliver a large order to an isolated, opulent estate owned by a reclusive billionaire named Mr. Graves, he didn't hesitate. The promise of a generous tip was too good to pass up. The journey to the estate was long and eerie. The road wound through dense woods and ended at a pair of towering iron gates. Beyond them, Eddie could see the mansion, a sprawling, Gothic structure that seemed to loom out of the darkness. He pressed the intercom button, and the gates slowly creaked open, inviting him in. He drove up the long driveway, feeling a growing sense of unease as he approached the mansion. When he parked and stepped out of his car, the front doors opened, and a man in a finely tailored suit emerged. His skin was unnaturally pale, and his eyes seemed to gleam with a strange light. "Welcome, Mr. Eddie," the man said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I am Mr. Graves. Please come in. We have been expecting you." Eddie followed Mr. Graves into the mansion, marveling at the opulence of the place. The entrance hall was adorned with crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and priceless artworks. Mr. Graves led him to a lavish banquet hall where an extravagant feast was laid out on a long, ornate table. Dozens of guests were seated, all eerily pale and silent, their eyes fixed on Eddie as he entered. "Please join us," Mr. Graves said, gesturing to an empty seat. "It is not often that we have new faces at our table." Eddie hesitated, but the promise of a generous tip and the allure of the rare and exquisite dishes on the table swayed him. He took a seat and began to eat. The food was unlike anything he had ever tasted, rich and decadent. But as he ate, an overwhelming sense of dread began to settle over him. He glanced around the table and noticed that none of the other guests were eating. Some of them appeared to be decaying, their skin mottled and their eyes hollow. A chill ran down his spine, and he set his fork down, no longer hungry. "Is something wrong?" Mr. Graves asked, his eyes boring into Eddie's. "No, everything's fine," Eddie lied, forcing a smile. "The food is amazing." As the meal continued, Eddie's sense of unease grew. He needed to find out what was going on. Excusing himself, he wandered the mansion, looking for answers. He discovered hidden passages behind the walls, and as he explored, he stumbled upon a dusty, forgotten library. There, he found an ancient diary belonging to Mr. Graves. The diary detailed Mr. Graves' discovery of an elixir that granted immortality, but at a terrible cost. The drinkers became trapped in a state between life and death, forever bound to the estate. Eddie's heart pounded as he realized that he had unwittingly consumed the elixir and was now part of this eternal cycle. He confronted Mr. Graves, who seemed almost relieved to reveal the truth. "I, too, am trapped by the elixir's curse," he confessed. "I have been using the feast to lure new people in hopes of finding a way to break the curse. But it seems there is no escape." Eddie felt a wave of despair wash over him. He could already feel the effects of the elixir taking hold, his skin growing pale and cold. "There must be a way to stop this," he pleaded. Mr. Graves shook his head. "I have searched for centuries and found nothing. The elixir binds us to this place, and now you are bound as well." Eddie's mind raced as he tried to think of a solution, but it was too late. The curse was already taking hold, his body betraying him. He returned to the banquet hall, his movements slow and labored. The other guests watched him with vacant eyes, their expressions devoid of hope. As the hours passed, Eddie's transformation continued. His skin grew paler, his eyes hollowed, and his movements became sluggish. He was now one of them, another soul trapped in the mansion's eternal grasp. In the final moments of his humanity, Eddie watched helplessly as another delivery worker arrived at the mansion, welcomed by the still charming but increasingly desperate Mr. Graves. The newcomer looked around, his eyes wide with curiosity and a hint of unease. Eddie tried to warn him, to shout a warning, but his voice was a mere whisper in the wind, unheard and unnoticed. He could only watch as the cycle continued, the mansion claiming another soul, while he remained a silent witness to the never-ending feast. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, as Eddie's existence became a blur of hollow routines and haunting memories. The mansion's opulence now felt like a gilded cage, its beauty masking the horrors within. The other guests, once vibrant individuals, were now mere shadows of their former selves, their eyes reflecting the torment of their eternal imprisonment. Eddie wandered the halls, searching for any glimmer of hope, but the mansion's malevolent presence seemed to anticipate his every move. He discovered more hidden passages and secret chambers, each revealing fragments of the estate's dark history. The spirits of previous guests haunted these forgotten corners, their whispers echoing through the walls, sharing tales of despair and hopelessness. One night, Eddie found himself drawn to the mansion's grand ballroom. The room was bathed in an eerie, ghostly light, and the air was thick with an unsettling energy. In the center of the ballroom stood Mr. Graves, his eyes reflecting a deep sadness. He seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. "Eddie," Mr. Graves said softly, his voice carrying a weight of centuries-old sorrow. "I see the torment in your eyes. I understand the pain of being trapped in this cursed existence." Eddie approached him, feeling a mix of anger and sympathy. "There has to be a way out," he insisted. "We can't be doomed to this fate forever." Mr. Graves sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I have tried everything within my power, but the elixir's curse is unbreakable. It binds us to this place, feeding off our despair." Desperation clawed at Eddie's heart. Then why continue the cycle? Why bring others into this nightmare? "Hope," Mr. Graves replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "A futile hope that one day someone might discover a way to break the curse. I cannot bear the thought of eternity without at least trying." Eddie's mind raced, grappling with the enormity of their situation. He knew he had to find a way to end the suffering, not just for himself, but for all the souls trapped within the mansion's walls. As he stood there, contemplating his next move, a chilling realization washed over him. The curse thrived on their despair and hopelessness. Perhaps breaking its hold required a different approach, a collective act of defiance and unity. Eddie turned to Mr. Graves, a newfound determination in his eyes. "What if we resist the curse together?" Eddie proposed. "What if we refuse to succumb to its power and fight back as one?" Mr. Graves regarded him with a mixture of surprise and hope. "You believe we can overcome the curse by sheer will alone?" Eddie nodded. "We have nothing to lose. If we stand together, united in our defiance, we might just weaken its grip." Word spread quickly among the other guests, and a flicker of hope ignited within their hollow eyes. They gathered in the grand ballroom, forming a circle around Eddie and Mr. Graves. The air crackled with a newfound energy, their collective determination palpable. As they joined hands, a surge of power coursed through the room. The mansion seemed to tremble in response, its malevolent presence weakening. The guests closed their eyes, focusing their thoughts on breaking free from the curse's grasp. Hours passed, but they remained resolute. The mansion's walls began to shift and crack, its hold on them loosening. The spirits of previous guests joined their efforts, their ethereal forms merging with the living, creating a powerful force of unity. With a final, desperate surge, the curse shattered. The mansion's oppressive energy dissipated, and the guests were freed from its grasp. Eddie opened his eyes, feeling a sense of relief and liberation. The grand ballroom was bathed in sunlight, the darkness banished. Mr. Graves smiled, tears of gratitude streaming down his pale cheeks. "We did it," he whispered. "We broke the curse." Eddie looked around at the once-trapped souls, now free to live their lives. They thanked him, their faces filled with newfound hope. As the mansion crumbled behind them, Eddie knew their ordeal was finally over. Together, they walked away from the ruins of the mansion, leaving behind the eternal feast that had once bound them. Eddie felt a profound sense of fulfillment, knowing he had played a part in breaking the cycle of despair. The road ahead was uncertain, but he faced it with courage, ready to embrace whatever came next.